All right, everyone, welcome back into another props video. Going to be breaking down the top prop bets that we have for Sunday on Prize Picks and Underdog. Let's go ahead and get into it. So yes, you guys heard that correctly. Going to be concentrating more on Prize Picks and Underdog for this video. If you guys want my deep dive video covering my favorite prop bets for the full slate on Sunday, go ahead and check that out. I posted that video yesterday. This is just going to be me highlighting the top prop bets that we are currently getting on the slate. Okay, there's a little bit of a difference there. Obviously, the top prop bets are going to be based off of the Vegas data that we have coming in. So we're just taking the Vegas data, comparing that against the Prize Picks line and the Underdog line. So the first really good prop bet that we have is actually going to be Aaron Rodgers to get over 14 for his fantasy score. Now, I will say there's a little bit of concern here for Aaron Rodgers, just in the sense that, yes, he threw for 4 passing touchdowns last week, but a little bit of a revenge game narrative, I guess, if you will. But really, and he could come down from that, but really, I think it's the low ADOT. He had the lowest ADOT in week 1 of the league, and I don't necessarily think that's going to be something that ends up changing for him. Also, that was a little bit rooted in the fact that they had the most multiple tight end snaps out of any team in the league, or in other words, the lowest amount of 3 receiver sets for any team. But what we're going to notice here is that this is a decent prop line difference between Prize Picks and Underdog, and I don't think it's a terrible matchup going against the Seattle Seahawks. There is a little bit of a revenge game narrative for DK Metcalf as well. If you guys want to look into that, you can there as well. Now, that being said, we have another bet in this game, and for the Steelers that I do not necessarily love, it's going to be Pat Freiermuth for over his fantasy score. So it's worth calling out. This is a bet that's over 54% likely to hit, so a bet that we would typically be targeting. Now, Pat Freiermuth did play 50% of the snaps and also played 50% or had a 50% route share as well. Okay, so that is nice for him. And it is a low line. Okay, he did end up with 3 targets for 3 catches and 28 yards. So basically the correct line there. I don't personally see us having a big edge with this bet. So I wouldn't stack Rodgers here. With that, I would just go Rodgers solo there. So I'm going to favorite Rodgers. Then we're going to move on into the next bet here. David Njoku for over his fantasy score. So this is not a bet that I particularly want to go out of my way to target, although I don't hate it as well. So David Njoku had an 84% snap share, 77% route share, ended up with 6 targets, 3 catches for 37 yards. Obviously, Harold Fannin, the rookie tight end, got a lot of work last week as well. Everyone is excited for him. Harold Fannin had a 30% target share. That is not something that's going to continue throughout the season. David Njoku still was their top tight end. Now, the issue with Njoku is really the matchup as well, but that could be a benefit for him. Okay, they are heavy underdogs in this game against the Baltimore Ravens. So it should be a pretty pass-heavy script for the Cleveland Browns. And if that is the case, then you would expect David Njoku to get some pretty soft targets and be able to benefit from that. It's not necessarily a bet I want to go out of my way to target, but this is a bet that if you guys like it, I also wouldn't talk you out of that as well. The fact that it has a 55.7% percentage, not terrible there. Now, a bet that I do like is actually Cooper Kupp to get over his 7.5 for his fantasy score. So last week, the Steelers defense did look pretty poor against Justin Fields. We don't know exactly what to expect, I will say, out of this Seahawks offense, but I do think it's going to be a week where the pendulum swings back towards more of a balanced attack. What I mean by that is JSN ended up with 13 targets, guys. He had a 62% target share, whereas Cooper Kupp only had a 14% target share. That is something that's not going to continue. And if you look at the stats, Cooper Kupp had a 92% route share, 88% snap share as well. He only ended up with 3 targets on the game. Okay, it went 2 for 15, which we don't love, but again, I just don't see how JSN gets that much work again. Now, that being said, Cooper Kupp did have a bad drop. It could have been Sam Darnold just be like, all right, I don't trust you. I'm going with JSN. I don't necessarily think that. I think we're going to see Cooper Kupp ended up having a decent game in this game. And so I'm fine getting to this one as well. This is one I'll favorite. So another bet that I like as well this week is going to be Cedric Tillman to get over his fantasy score here of 9.5. Now, I already called some bets I like with Cedric Tillman. Basically, his over receptions is a bet that I like as well. But if you want to go with over his fantasy score, I do think that this is a bet that does go hand in hand. Okay, so he has that, last week he had 8 targets, guys. He had a 96% route share and 88% snap share in general, which is great. We love that. Okay, he was treated the exact same as Jerry Jeudy. But again, the big part of this is that he gets a good matchup going against the Baltimore Ravens, a team that, for, I will say, most of the game last week, looked fine on defense. And then at the tail end of the game, it got terrible for them. Okay, that secondary is expected to be bad. That's why they brought in Alexander. And as a Packers fan, kind of felt like he was washed, and I think we kind of saw that in week 1. And so this should be a good matchup for receivers throughout the whole season. And again, it should be a pass-heavy script. And so I like that. I can get on board with this. The data is telling us to like it. I will agree with the data here. Now, we go ahead and take a peek at some of the other bets that we have pulling up. I do not necessarily like Mike Gesicki, guys, just to talk about it. Noah Fant outsnapped him, and when that signing occurred for Noah Fant, I actually thought he would be the more consistent player. That's not to say Mike Gesicki can't get 2 catches and get the over here. Just not a bet that I want to target. That's kind of the same with Pat Freiermuth, but I don't mind this bet for Hunter Henry. Okay, so Keyshawn Boutte was the receiver number 1 last week for the New England Patriots, which was a little bit of a shock to people. He had a 20% target share, but also you got to talk about Hunter Henry, who had a 22% target share. Now, he only played in 74% or had a 74% route share, Hunter Henry did, but he did play in 82% of the snaps. So very encouraging there for Hunter Henry. And a big factor in this as well is that the backup tight end, Austin Hooper, only played in 32% of the snaps. So it was a week in which we did see a lot of 11 personnel. 59% of the snaps were 11 personnel. So 1 tight end, 1 running back. And that should bode well for Hunter Henry, who ended up with 10.6 fantasy points last week. And that was without a touchdown. So I'm fine getting to this bet here with Hunter Henry. And then this next bet is going to be another one that I actually really like on the slate as well. Another player that I've already mentioned. That's going to be looking at Odunze to get over his 10 for his fantasy score. So he was their receiver number 1 last week. Basically did not leave the field. We saw it towards the end of the game. He got a lot more work. There was a point of emphasis of getting him the football. And although Ben Johnson has told us there's going to be more of a run-heavy script in this game against Detroit, we'll see if that ends up holding up. The fact that Odunze got treated as the receiver number 1 is encouraging for him. DJ Moore got used a bunch in kind of unique ways for sure, but there was a lot of rumors that Odunze could have the role that he had last week, and so I'm going to buy into the role that he has now from week 1. And I already mentioned I liked his receptions props, but again, the data is telling us that this 10 is a little bit too low for him. I'm okay getting there, okay? And so it is worth calling out here that with all these fantasy score prop bets, the whole point of the fantasy score prop bets is kind of betting on maybe he doesn't get to his over receptions. Maybe he gets there with 1 big play in the receiving game, catching a ball, receiving yards wise. Maybe he ends up with a touchdown. The whole point of a fantasy score line is kind of predicting that a player is not being valued as properly, okay? Because a player can go off in a game without getting some of their overs, right? James Conner had a fine game in week 1, scoring a touchdown. He got his over fantasy score, but he didn't get his over rush attempts. Stuff like that happens a bunch. And so it's a kind of way of negating that. But at the same time, we do tend to see that the fantasy scores are a little bit elevated to adjust for kind of that variance as well. So I tend to like to just go with the quarterbacks more so, and that's where Aaron Rodgers is one of the better ones. So it's kind of my long way of saying if you guys like any of the other bets a little bit more for some of those players, the data is also essentially telling us that there as well. So do want to highlight some of the other bets that we have coming in that are decent. Kyron Williams, I don't mind for his under, but also not a bet that I need to go crazy with. I do think there's a good chance that that is a run-heavy game for the Rams where they're just trying to have a time of possession type of game. That is what is kind of expected. And this one with Kenneth Gainwell is definitely interesting here, guys. We are seeing a pretty big prop line difference between prize picks and underdog, how they are valuing him. And so if you want to get to his over on underdog and under on prize picks, you could end up doing that. That's not a terrible way to go. And then really my last favorite bet on the slate for prize picks is going to be Stephon Diggs to get over his 9 for his fantasy score. So the reason I like this is because I do expect him to get a little bit more work this week than what he had last week. Okay, last week he was still returning from injury. I think everyone kind of knows that. But he still ended up playing 56% of the snaps total, but still had a 70% route share. He ended up with 7 targets on the game, 6 receptions, 57 receiving yards. I do think his baseline, fantasy score for the year is going to be around 10. Okay, that is what we should be expecting from him. And so price was being a little bit lower on him. I think that is a bet that we could end up getting to there as well. So let's take a peek at some of the bets that are being generated for us here, guys. Bet slips, highlighting some of the bets that I like. And here we go. So if we're looking for a 25x slip bet here, guys, this is what we're looking at. So we got Rodgers, Cooper Kupp, Tillman, Henry, Odunze, and Stephon Diggs to get over their fantasy score. Very solid bet for us. This one has about a 0.95% edge over prize picks. Okay, so that should, not a massive edge, but we'll take that for the week 2 slate. And so if you guys are a 9 to 5 member, you guys get access to this Prize Picks Optimizer. You can just click on this link here for the Prize Picks Optimizer, and then it'll automatically populate the bet slip for you. Now, guys, I mentioned I was going to do an underdog video. I might save that for later on today. This video was going a little bit longer than I was planning on, so apologies for that, but be on the lookout for that. It is a little bit different in terms of what we're looking at there for underdog, so be on the lookout for that if I end up having enough time to put that out, honestly, but hopefully I will. Give a like, subscribe to the channel, guys. If you guys would like access to that Prize Picks Optimizer tool, head on over to 9to5sports.com. Get access to all the tools available on 9to5sports.com for $10 a month. Thank you guys for watching. Good luck. And as always, let's keep cashing.